The Kansas wind swept across the endless prairie as the wagon rolled into Abilene, carrying dust devils in its wake and promises that felt as fragile as the dried grass along the trail. Catherine Hayes sat beside her husband Michael, a hired hand who'd found work on the Bennett Ranch after their money ran out in Missouri. She kept her gloved hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon where wheat fields stretched toward infinity under a sky so vast it made her feel impossibly small. The town materialized from the flatlands like a mirage, wooden buildings clustered along the railroad tracks, grain elevators rising like sentinels over the prairie. This was nothing like Boston, where Catherine had spent 26 years in a world of brick townhouses, university halls, and botanical gardens. That life had ended 18 months ago when her father's shipping business collapsed, taking their fortune and social standing with it. She'd married Michael Hayes quickly, a kind man from their church who offered stability if not passion, and they'd headed west, seeking fresh starts that seemed to retreat like the horizon with every mile traveled. As they passed the Bennett Ranch House, a substantial two-story structure painted white with a wide porch, Catherine noticed the irrigation ditches running through the fields. They were poorly designed, she observed instinctively, allowing too much water loss through evaporation and failing to reach the far sections efficiently. She caught herself before commenting, remembering the carefully constructed story of her past. Catherine Hayes was a simple farmer's daughter from Connecticut, nothing more. No one could know about her degree in agricultural science from Radcliffe College, about the research she'd conducted on soil conservation and crop rotation, about the thesis she'd written on innovative irrigation techniques. Women with education were threats to the natural order, her mother had warned before Catherine left Boston. Keep your knowledge hidden, or you'll never find peace anywhere you go. Thomas Bennett had built his ranch through intelligence and perseverance, turning inherited prairie land into one of the most productive wheat operations in central Kansas. At 42, he'd weathered droughts, grasshopper plagues, and market crashes that destroyed lesser men. He prided himself on being a fair employer, paying decent wages and providing solid housing for his workers. When Michael Hayes arrived with his young wife, Thomas noticed immediately that something didn't fit. Catherine moved with a careful restraint that suggested she was constantly monitoring herself, editing her natural behavior into something more acceptable. She helped the other ranch wives with cooking and mending, never complaining about the harsh conditions or primitive accommodations. But Thomas caught moments when she thought no one was watching, when her eyes would study the fields with an intensity that went beyond casual observation. One afternoon, he found her standing at the edge of his experimental wheat plot, examining the stalks with focused attention. She didn't notice his approach, too absorbed in her analysis. Thomas cleared his throat and Catherine jumped, color flooding her face, as if she'd been caught stealing. By mid-June, the usual afternoon thunderstorms that watered the wheat fields failed to appear. Day after scorching day passed with cloudless skies and temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. The wheat began to suffer, stalks turning from healthy green to stressed yellow-brown. Thomas watched his crops with growing anxiety, knowing that if the drought continued, he'd lose not only his own harvest, but the livelihoods of every family who depended on his ranch. She apologized quickly, explaining she'd just been curious about the different variety. Her words were carefully simple, but her eyes betrayed deeper understanding. Thomas asked what she thought of the crop. Catherine hesitated, clearly weighing her response. Finally, she said it looked healthy, but might benefit from different spacing. Then she caught herself adding hastily that she didn't really know about such things, just something she'd heard somewhere. Thomas let it pass, but his curiosity was thoroughly aroused. Over the following weeks, he found himself watching Catherine Hayes, noting how she positioned herself to observe everything while appearing to focus on domestic tasks. He saw her fingers trace patterns in the dirt when she thought no one looked, mathematical calculations perhaps, or diagrams. Whatever Catherine Hayes was hiding, Thomas suspected it had nothing to do with criminality and everything to do with capability. Summer arrived with unrelenting heat that turned the Kansas prairie into a furnace. He increased irrigation, but the creek that fed his water system was dropping rapidly, and the poorly designed ditches wasted precious water with every passing day. Other ranchers faced worse situations, lacking even basic irrigation systems. Throughout the community, tension mounted as farmers watched their investments wither under the merciless sun. Catherine observed the crisis with quiet desperation. She knew solutions existed, had studied them extensively during her university years. Efficient irrigation techniques, mulching strategies to retain soil moisture, crop varieties better suited to drought conditions, all tools that could mitigate the disaster unfolding around them. But revealing such knowledge meant exposing herself, inviting questions she couldn't answer without admitting her education. Michael would be humiliated, learning his wife had deceived him about her past. The community would reject her, possibly forcing them to leave and seek work elsewhere, yet watching families face ruin when she possessed knowledge to help felt unbearable. One evening, unable to contain herself, Catherine suggested to Michael that perhaps the irrigation ditches could be modified to reduce water loss. Michael looked at her with surprise, asking how she'd know about such things. Catherine retreated immediately, saying she'd just heard the other women talking, must have misunderstood, but the words hung between them, a crack in the careful facade she'd maintained. That night, Catherine lay awake beside her sleeping husband, wrestling with the choice between self-preservation and moral obligation, between the safety of anonymity and the risk of revelation. Thomas Bennett had developed instincts about people during his years managing a large operation. Something about Catherine Hayes nagged at him persistently, a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture she presented. He began paying closer attention, noting small inconsistencies. Her handwriting, glimpsed on a shopping list, was educated and precise. Her vocabulary, when she forgot to simplify it, suggested extensive reading. The way she moved through the world spoke of someone trained to think systematically, not someone raised on a small farm. One afternoon, Thomas visited the workers' quarters to discuss harvest preparations with Michael. Catherine was alone, standing at the small table with papers spread before her, so absorbed she didn't hear his approach. Thomas saw detailed diagrams of irrigation systems, calculations, notes written in careful script about water flow rates and soil absorption. Catherine sensed his presence and turned, her face draining of color. She moved to gather the papers frantically, but Thomas gently caught her wrist. He asked quietly what she was working on. She explained about her father's business failure, about Radcliffe College and her agricultural science degree, about the necessity of hiding her education to maintain any chance at a normal life. No one could know this, she begged. If people learned she'd deceived them, deceived Michael about who she really was, they'd be ruined. Her husband had married a simple farm girl, not some educated woman who'd pretended to be less than she was. Thomas would tell everyone, and she'd lose everything she'd tried to build in this new life. Thomas stood silent, processing this revelation. He asked why she'd hidden such valuable knowledge, especially now when it could help so many people. Catherine explained that society didn't accept educated women, that her capabilities threatened men, made her unmarriageable, dangerous. So she'd buried that part of herself to survive. Thomas looked at the irrigation diagrams scattered across the table, seeing innovation and expertise that could save his ranch, possibly the entire community. He faced a choice that would affect everyone involved. Thomas Bennett made a decision that surprised even himself. He would keep Catherine's secret, but he would also use her knowledge. He proposed a private arrangement. Catherine would advise him on agricultural improvements, and he would present the ideas as his own innovations. She would remain safely anonymous, while her expertise saved crops and livelihoods. Catherine was torn between relief and frustration, grateful for protection, but pained by the continued deception. Yet she agreed, seeing no better option. They began meeting secretly in the early mornings, before others awoke, Catherine sketching improved irrigation designs while Thomas memorized her explanations so he could present them convincingly. She taught him about soil moisture retention, optimal planting depths for drought conditions, and water conservation techniques she'd researched at Radcliffe. Thomas proved a quick student, genuinely interested in the science behind the methods. Within 2 weeks, Thomas implemented the first changes, redesigning the main irrigation ditches according to Catherine's specifications. He explained to his workers that he'd been studying agricultural journals from Eastern universities, learning new techniques. The improved system immediately showed results, delivering water more efficiently and reducing waste by nearly 40%. Other ranchers noticed, asking Thomas about his methods. He shared the knowledge freely, crediting unnamed university research rather than revealing his secret advisor. As word spread and other farms implemented similar improvements, Catherine watched her ideas save harvests throughout the region. The satisfaction was bittersweet, knowing her contribution would never be acknowledged, but at least the knowledge was being used for good. Michael noticed his wife spending time talking with Thomas occasionally and grew suspicious, questioning why the ranch owner would seek out a worker's wife for conversation. Catherine explained she'd been asking about household matters, but she could see doubt in her husband's eyes. The secret arrangement that had seemed like a solution was creating new complications, threatening to expose everything in ways none of them had anticipated. The drought intensified through July, pushing even improved irrigation systems to their limits. Thomas held emergency meetings with neighboring ranchers, sharing techniques Catherine had taught him. The community began to stabilize, but water remained critically scarce. Catherine suggested implementing a more radical solution, a cooperative reservoir system that would require multiple ranchers to pool resources and share water according to scientific allocation formulas she'd developed. Thomas understood the potential, but worried about the complexity of explaining such an advanced system without revealing his source. Meanwhile, tensions grew in Catherine's marriage. Michael had accepted his wife's friendship with their employer as innocent, but other workers' wives whispered about the frequent conversations, the way Thomas sought Catherine's opinions, however subtly. Michael confronted her one evening, asking directly if something inappropriate was happening. Catherine assured him Thomas was simply kind, sometimes asking her to relay messages to other wives or help organize community events. The lies accumulated like stones in her chest, each one necessary but heavy. She hated deceiving Michael, who'd offered her security when she had nothing. He deserved honesty, yet the truth would destroy him. The irony wasn't lost on Catherine. She'd married to escape the consequences of her education, only to find herself using that education in secret, creating exactly the kind of deception and complication she'd hoped to avoid. Thomas faced his own crisis of conscience. He'd initially justified the arrangement as protecting Catherine while helping the community, but he was increasingly uncomfortable claiming credit for her innovations. Other ranchers praised his brilliance, his forward thinking. Thomas felt like a fraud, even as he recognized that revealing the truth would harm Catherine irreparably. One afternoon, as they reviewed reservoir plans in his study, Thomas asked Catherine if she ever regretted hiding her capabilities. Catherine was quiet for a long moment before answering that she regretted the world that made hiding necessary, but she'd learned to accept reality. "Some battles couldn't be won," she said softly, "so you survived the best way you could." Thomas disagreed, suggesting that maybe some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. August brought a community crisis point. The drought showed no signs of breaking, and several smaller ranchers faced complete crop failure despite improved techniques. A town meeting was called to discuss emergency measures. Thomas arrived prepared to present Catherine's cooperative reservoir plan, having spent days memorizing every detail so he could answer questions convincingly. The meeting hall filled with worried farmers, their wives and townspeople whose businesses depended on agricultural success. Catherine sat in the back with other workers' families, her stomach churning with anxiety as Thomas stood to present ideas that originated in her research notebooks. He explained the reservoir concept clearly, using a large diagram he'd drawn from Catherine's sketches. The system would pool water resources, distribute them scientifically based on soil types and crop needs, and maximize efficiency through coordinated management. The room erupted in questions. How would water allocation be determined fairly? Who would manage the system? What would it cost? Thomas answered methodically, but some questions went beyond his understanding. How would water allocation be determined fairly? Who would manage the system? What would it cost? Thomas answered methodically, but some questions went beyond his understanding. When pressed on the mathematical formulas for calculating optimal distribution, Thomas hesitated, realizing he'd reached the limits of his memorized knowledge. He glanced toward Catherine unconsciously, a split-second look that several people noticed. Catherine felt her face flush hot as eyes turned toward her briefly before returning to Thomas. He recovered quickly, promising to provide detailed calculations at a follow-up meeting, but doubt had entered the room. Why would a rancher, however successful, have such sophisticated knowledge of agricultural science? Where had these ideas really come from? After the meeting, several ranchers approached Thomas privately, expressing support but also curiosity about his sudden expertise. One mentioned having a cousin who'd attended an Eastern agricultural college, saying the techniques Thomas described sounded remarkably similar to advanced university research. Thomas deflected carefully, but he felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. That evening, he found Catherine near the creek, staring at water that flowed lower each day. He apologized for nearly exposing her, admitting the deception was becoming unsustainable. Catherine nodded slowly, acknowledging they couldn't continue this way indefinitely. Something would have to change. Michael Hayes wasn't an educated man, but he wasn't stupid either. He'd noticed the knowing looks between his wife and Thomas Bennett, the way Catherine sometimes used words that seemed beyond her supposed background, her unusual interest in agricultural matters. When other workers began joking about the boss's special interest in Hayes's pretty wife, Michael's patience ended. He confronted Catherine directly, demanding the truth about her relationship with Thomas. Catherine insisted nothing inappropriate was happening, but Michael pushed harder, asking why Thomas constantly sought her out, why she seemed so interested in ranch operations. Backed into a corner, Catherine made a decision. She told Michael everything, watching his face transform from suspicion to shock to hurt anger as she revealed her hidden education, her deception about her past, her secret consultation with Thomas. Michael felt betrayed on multiple levels. His wife had lied about who she was from the beginning. She'd pretended to be less educated, less capable, essentially performing a role for their entire marriage. And she'd been meeting secretly with another man, even if the meetings were supposedly about farming techniques. Catherine tried to explain her reasoning, the impossibility of being honest about her education, the necessity of hiding to have any chance at marriage and stability. And she'd been meeting secretly with another man, even if the meetings were supposedly about farming techniques. She asked a simple question. If Catherine had all this knowledge that could help people, why shouldn't she share it openly? Catherine explained about social consequences, about how educated women were rejected, unmarriageable, threatening. Martha snorted dismissively, saying that sounded like nonsense invented by men, afraid of competition. Catherine tried to explain her reasoning, the impossibility of being honest about her education, the necessity of hiding to have any chance at marriage and stability. But Michael heard only that she'd considered him too simple, too threatened by capable women to handle the truth. He asked bitterly if she'd ever actually loved him or just needed a convenient husband to provide cover for her fresh start. Catherine had no good answer. She cared for Michael, appreciated his kindness, but love. She'd been too desperate for security to worry much about love. That night, Michael moved his belongings to the bachelor workers' quarters, leaving Catherine alone in their small house. The separation sent shockwaves through the ranch community. Workers and their families speculated wildly about what had caused the sudden split. Some assumed infidelity. Others suggested Catherine had been revealed as something scandalous from her past. The truth remained hidden, but the gossip created an atmosphere of suspicion that touched everyone involved, including Thomas, whose reputation as a fair and honorable employer now faced quiet questions. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Michael, hurt and angry, began drinking at the town saloon, where his bitter comments about his deceptive wife and the rancher who'd encouraged her secrets reached sympathetic ears. Within days, half the town whispered about some scandal involving Catherine Hayes and Thomas Bennett, though nobody knew actual details. Thomas's position in the community, built over decades of honest dealing, suddenly faced doubt. Several ranchers who'd implemented Catherine's techniques now questioned their effectiveness, wondering if they'd been fooled by smooth talk rather than genuine innovation. At Sunday church, Catherine felt the weight of stares and whispers. She sat alone, Michael having stopped attending entirely, and endured judgmental looks from women who'd once been friendly. After the service, Martha Crawford, Thomas's sister, who'd recently arrived from Topeka, approached Catherine directly. Martha was a formidable woman who'd run her own boarding house for 15 years and had little patience for social pretense. She stated bluntly that she'd heard rumors about Catherine and her brother, and she wanted the truth. Catherine, exhausted by deception and its consequences, made a split-second decision. She asked Martha to walk with her away from the church crowd. In quiet privacy, Catherine revealed everything. Her education, her hidden expertise, the secret consultation arrangement, her marriage's collapse. She explained that nothing inappropriate had occurred between her and Thomas, only the sharing of knowledge she couldn't publicly acknowledge possessing. Martha listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes assessing Catherine's sincerity. She suggested that maybe the problem wasn't Catherine's education, but everyone else's narrow-mindedness. Catherine felt something shift inside her, a possibility she'd never seriously considered. What if she stopped hiding? What if she stood openly as who she really was, and forced the community to accept or reject her honestly? Thomas called another community meeting to present the detailed calculations for the reservoir system. Catherine knew this was the moment of truth. She could remain silent, let Thomas struggle through explanations he didn't fully understand, and maintain her safe anonymity. Or she could step forward and claim her own knowledge, consequences be damned. The meeting hall filled once again with concerned farmers. Thomas began his presentation, but questions quickly exceeded his prepared answers. When asked to explain the mathematical formulas determining water allocation ratios, Thomas fumbled, clearly out of his depth. Frustration rippled through the crowd. They'd trusted him, implemented his suggestions, but now wondered if he actually understood what he'd been promoting. Henry Morrison, a large rancher from the Eastern District, stood and challenged Thomas directly. He accused Thomas of repeating things he'd read without truly comprehending them, of potentially misleading desperate farmers with half-understood theories. The crowd murmured agreement. Thomas's credibility was collapsing. Catherine sat in her usual back row, heart pounding. She watched Thomas struggle, saw the community's faith in him dying, knew the reservoir project that could save so many farms would be abandoned if confidence wasn't restored. Martha Crawford, seated beside Catherine, leaned close and whispered fiercely that this was her moment, that hiding truth to avoid discomfort was cowardice. Catherine thought of her thesis research, her years of study, the knowledge she'd worked so hard to acquire, and then buried to survive in a world that didn't want educated women. She thought of her failed marriage, the price she'd paid for deception. She thought of the crops dying in the fields, the families facing ruin, the solutions she possessed that were being rejected because people doubted their source. Catherine stood, her movement drawing eyes throughout the room. Thomas looked at her with alarm and recognition. She walked slowly down the center aisle, every step feeling like crossing into unknown territory. When she reached the front, Catherine turned to face the assembled community. "No one can know this," she whispered to Thomas, but loud enough for others to hear. Thomas looked up at her, understanding what she was about to do. Then Catherine spoke clearly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She explained she couldn't watch him take blame for her ideas any longer. She couldn't let good solutions be rejected due to misrepresentation. Catherine Hayes told the assembled crowd exactly who she was. She explained about her father's shipping business in Boston, about Radcliffe College and her degree in agricultural science, about her thesis research on irrigation systems and drought-resistant farming techniques. She described how financial ruin had forced her west, how she'd hidden her education to marry and survive in a world that rejected educated women. She acknowledged deceiving her husband and the community about her past, taking full responsibility for those choices. Then she turned to the technical matters at hand. Catherine walked to the diagram Thomas had drawn and began explaining the reservoir system with the confidence of someone who designed it. She wrote equations on the board, calculated water allocation formulas, answered every question with precision and expertise. She described soil science, water conservation principles, and agricultural innovations with the authority of years of study and research. The room sat in stunned silence. Some faces showed shock, others anger at being deceived, still others dawning respect for the knowledge being displayed. Catherine didn't stop until she'd answered every technical question, provided every calculation, and demonstrated beyond doubt that she possessed genuine expertise. When she finished, Catherine stood quietly waiting for judgment. Henry Morrison recovered first, standing slowly. He asked bluntly why they should trust anything she said, given she'd lied about who she was. Catherine acknowledged the fairness of the question. She explained that her knowledge was verifiable, her credentials could be checked with Radcliffe College, and the techniques she'd suggested had already proven effective on multiple ranches. Her deception about her personal history didn't change the validity of agricultural science. She added that she understood if they couldn't accept solutions from a woman, even if those solutions could save their farms. That choice was theirs to make. Martha Crawford stood, announcing that she'd trust expertise over prejudice any day. She stated that if her brother Thomas believed in Catherine's knowledge enough to stake his reputation on it, that was good enough for her. Sarah Chen, wife of a small farmer facing complete ruin, rose and said her family couldn't afford to reject help based on where it came from. Slowly, others added their voices, a mixture of support and lingering doubt filling the room. The vote to proceed with the reservoir project passed by a narrow margin. Not everyone accepted Catherine's expertise, and several families remained uncomfortable with an educated woman advising on agricultural matters.